The 18th of January, 1945, before dawn, near Pszczyna in Upper Silesia. The column moved along the icy shoulder of the road, packed in rows of 5 and 6, unable to spread out for fear of beatings and gunfire. The thermometer had dropped far below zero, and the air cut into the damp skin beneath the striped uniforms. Every few minutes, someone stumbled and went down to their knees. When the pace broke, the SS guards closed the distance with quick steps, rifle butts raised, and the flat crack of a shot was left behind without the march stopping. In the middle of the column, one woman dragged another by the arm. She could not hold her much longer, but letting go meant falling behind. On that stretch of the evacuation from Auschwitz, punishment was not an exceptional measure. It was the method. There were no ambulances, no stretchers, no rear guard collecting the fallen. There was a simple order, shouted in German, "Keep walking." When the road narrowed at a bridge, the mass compressed, and the steam of hundreds of breaths formed a low cloud that hid faces. Under that cloud, some began to lose consciousness without fully collapsing, pushed forward by the body coming from behind. Those who still had strength kept their eyes on the ground to avoid seeing the ditches, because bodies that did not get up lay in the ditches. Hours earlier, dozens of kilometers away, at the Auschwitz complex, SS Sturmbannführer Richard Baer, the camp commandant, had received frontline reports that left no room for interpretation. The Red Army was advancing fast, and German lines were breaking. The evacuation, which for months had been prepared in stages, was entering its final phase. That phase did not begin on the road. It began in an office, with papers, stamps, prisoner lists, and destruction orders. The stretch at Pszczyna was only the point where those decisions became bodies in motion. Kilometers below zero, the evacuation march. On the 12th of January 1945, the Soviet Vistula Oder offensive began. At Auschwitz, the sound of the front was not abstract news. Distant glows appeared in the sky, and on some days dull thuds could be heard, as if the earth were breathing with difficulty. Since the previous summer, the SS administration had reduced material that could reveal the scale of the crimes and had moved groups of prisoners out of the complex toward the interior of the Reich. The aim was twofold: preserve enslaved labor for production, and at the same time, prevent prisoners from remaining alive in enemy hands to describe what had happened. The Soviet push into Silesia would force the final movement. Within the structure of the concentration camp system, Auschwitz depended on a chain of command that did not function through improvisation, but through formal communications and divided responsibilities. Inside the camp there were offices for prisoner registration, labor control, supplies, medical records, and internal administration. Above them, the SS apparatus linked the complex to central agencies that oversaw transfers, labor allocation, and discipline. When the military threat became immediate, that bureaucracy began to operate by a simple rule: remove what could be useful, destroy what could incriminate, and move out the prisoners who could walk. The initial reaction was to speed up the emptying in stages. In the subcamps tied to industries and quarries, local officials received instructions to prepare columns, concentrate prisoners, and arrange escorts. In Birkenau itself, lists were reviewed quickly. Who was fit to march? Who was considered unfit? Who could be forced to march even if ill? The immediate consequence of that administrative selection was that survival ceased to depend on age or trade, and came to depend, to a large extent, on the physical ability to stay on one's feet for hours over snow and ice. On January 17, the mass evacuation began. Over several days, roughly 56,000 prisoners, men and women, left Auschwitz and its subcamps under escort by armed SS. It was not a single column, but multiple formations departing at different hours, along planned routes toward railway stations to the west. Some marches headed toward Zisław-Śląski, known in German as Loslau. Others went toward Glewitz in German documentation. The logistical plan was to bring prisoners to those stations and, from there, load them into freight cars for shipment to camps deeper inside Germany. That design created an immediate problem. There were more prisoners capable of walking than there was transport capacity available in the short term. The result was a prolonged march in extreme temperatures, with minimal pauses and a control system based on direct violence. Columns left the complex carrying baggage that, in theory, was to be limited to essentials. In practice, many carried a blanket, a bowl, a piece of bread, a jacket obtained by barter or theft, or simply nothing. The unspoken rule was that any load became a burden in the first stretch. The first kilometers became a test of imposed discipline. At the road margins, guards forced the pace and tightened spacing between prisoners to prevent escapes. If someone stepped aside for bodily need or dizziness, they risked beatings or isolation. The most common reaction among prisoners was to focus on a repeated calculation, one more step, then another, without looking for an end. The immediate consequence was that the weakest began to fall from the start, before the cold had fully done its work. Unlike a rail transfer, the march exposed the movement of the concentration camp system to local populations. In some Upper Silesian towns, residents tried to bring water or food. In others, fear of reprisals and the presence of armed guards kept people at a distance. The SS response, when they detected attempts to help, varied, from forcibly pushing people back to firing to clear the road. That variability created uncertainty, and uncertainty sustained control. The column did not move as a homogeneous unit. Inside it, small survival hierarchies formed. Those with relatively intact shoes, those walking with rags on their feet, those supporting a companion, those trying to slip toward the center to avoid the guard's view. In that movement, the first night was decisive. As darkness fell, the ground became harder and more slippery. Bodies, already dehydrated, lost heat quickly. The pace held because stopping meant not getting up again. At rest points when they existed, there were no prepared facilities. Columns stopped in open fields, roadside edges, or courtyards, and prisoners sat wherever they could, without fire, with snow under their clothing, with hunger intensifying the feeling of cold. Guards spread out around them and used flashlights to control the perimeter. Prisoners' reaction in those poses was to try to conserve heat by clustering, but that proximity sometimes caused falls and crushing when the march restarted abruptly. The consequence was a silent loss of strength. Anyone who stood up late fell behind in seconds. At the exit from the complex, not everyone was included. Thousands of prisoners too sick or too exhausted to march were left in Auschwitz. For the SS administration, those people represented both risk and burden. The next step, in the logic of evacuation, was to abandon them with minimal resources and concentrate effort on moving those who could be transferred. That decision, made within camp bureaucracy, ensured the march was both a transfer operation and a brutal filter. The route selected, kilometer by kilometer, who reached a station alive. As the columns moved away from Auschwitz, the routes split. The itinerary to Władysław Śląski ran through Pszena and crossed forests and open fields where wind met no obstacles. The route to Gliwice ran through Tiki and Mikow, with urban stretches where movement slowed and surveillance grew more nervous because of nearby houses, corners, and courtyards where someone might try to hide. On paper, the distances were not impossible. Tens of kilometers. The problem was prisoners' physical condition and the way the pace was enforced. The march was not set by the slowest person's capacity, but by the guards' impatience. Within the columns, any attempt at reorganization was settled by force. When the front of the march quickened to gain ground, the rear compressed. Those behind could not see obstacles and collided with those ahead. That pressure produced chain falls. The SS reaction, seeing the pileup, was not to stop and redistribute, but to clear it with blows, kicks, and shots into the air. The immediate consequence was that those on the ground had seconds to get up. If they failed, they became incidents resolved on the road's edge. Escort logistics were also decisive. The SS did not have unlimited manpower to cover kilometers of road with columns that long. To compensate, they relied on visibility, keeping prisoners in a compact mass, with guards on the flanks, some at the front, and others closing the march. Those who tried to slip into a ditch or side entrance did so during moments of confusion, when the column crossed an intersection or slope, but even those opportunities were rare. In Silesian winter, open ground left footprints, and traces were visible from far away. In the subcamps, the situation added its own brutality. Hundreds of kilometers from final destinations, some work detachments began even longer marches. From Jaworzno, for example, a column was organized with the aim of linking into the Gross-Rosen system in Lower Silesia. The distance far exceeded that to Loslau or Gleiwitz and turned the transfer into a war of attrition with no margin. For those leaving those subcamps, the first day already set the pattern. Walk until the body failed, and then discover the system made no allowance for failure. At Monowitz, the camp tied to industrial production, the evacuation was initially framed by labor utility, but military urgency ultimately overrode it. Prisoners left in what they wore, with rations that when present amounted to a piece of bread or a watery soup before departure. Many reacted by saving food as a lifeline for the next day. The consequence was that first-stretch hunger was endured at the cost of accumulated weakness. Saving food meant walking on emptiness, burning minimal reserves, and entering the night without sufficient heat. On the roads, violence was not limited to shots fired at stragglers. Guards used beatings to prevent the march from fragmenting. They used dogs to press forward where the column stalled, and they spontaneously singled out those they judged problematic. Sometimes a gesture, repeated falls, or an argument over a place in the center of the line was enough. In that context, prisoners reacted by avoiding any visibility, eyes forward, no talking, no complaints. The immediate consequence was a forced discipline that turned the column into a silent mechanism, where the dominant sound was the drag of wet soles. At the same time, the evacuation had another administrative dimension: the destruction of evidence. In the complex, there remained warehouses, documents, records, and structures that, for the SS, had to be eliminated or at least rendered useless. That task competed with the urgency of moving prisoners out. The result was an overloaded administration that prioritized what could be done quickly. Putting columns on the road was quick. Organizing medical transport, adequate rations, or rest was slow. The consequence appeared in how the march was designed. The essential goal was to move bodies, not keep them alive under minimally stable conditions. When columns reached the first larger towns, control tightened. In some areas, prisoners heard rumors that the Red Army was close. Elsewhere, contradictory stories circulated about available trains. The reaction was an increase in escape attempts in urban stretches where gates, courtyards, and corners existed. The consequence was an escalation of preventive violence, shots to intimidate, beatings to accelerate, visible executions to set the example. The message was simple. The road was a space without rules for those marching, and with absolute rules for those guarding. At that point, the death march from Auschwitz ceased to be, even in the perpetrator's own logic and orderly transfer. It became a race against time and against the physical collapse of thousands. The next step planned by the SS administration was boarding at railway stations and dispersal to other camps. But before reaching the platforms, each column had to survive a journey in which cold, starvation, and violence worked at the same time, minute by minute, on bodies that had spent months or years being reduced to their minimum resilience. The first contingents to reach Gliwice did so in conditions that no longer allowed one to speak of a coherent group. They arrived in waves, with irregular gaps in the column, with people supported by others, with lines that broke apart crossing a street and were forced closed again by blows. At the station, the operational aim was to load quickly. Guards used yards and nearby open ground as gathering areas. There, for hours, prisoners stood exposed, without water, waiting for the necessary number to fill a series of cars. The immediate reaction at that point was predictable. Those who had kept a piece of bread rationed it into crumbs. Those who had kept nothing searched for clean snow or licked frost from a wooden edge. The consequence of that prolonged waiting was that when the order finally came to climb into the train, many no longer had the energy to pull themselves up through the opening. At Wodzisław Śląski Loslau, the scene repeated on a different scale. Columns that had passed through Pszczyna arrived after 2 or 3 days of marching, depending on pace and stops. There, rail logistics became a bottleneck. There were not enough trains to absorb tens of thousands of prisoners evacuated from Auschwitz and its subcamps at once. Local administration, caught in the chaos of military movements, assigned tracks according to priorities not designed to protect lives, but to keep materiel and troops moving. The result was that some contingents were stranded in Loslau longer than could be endured in those conditions. The SS response was to keep prisoners concentrated and under guard, allowing no dispersal or shelter, then accelerate loading when a train finally appeared. The immediate consequence was a brutal embarkation, bodies shoved like freight until the interior of the car was saturated. Rail transport, intended as the second phase of evacuation, multiplied the risks already present on the road. The cars were freight wagons, closed, with a small opening, no heating, and minimal ventilation. Inside, the air thickened quickly. Those who arrived soaked by melted snow and sweat were exposed to rapid chilling when the train stopped and cold air seeped through the crack. Inside, prisoners reacted by trying to create a core of human warmth, pressing together, taking turns for a spot near a wall, lifting those who slid to the floor. The consequence was that the space became a field of forces where the weak always lost, not because someone attacked them, but because the environment expelled them. At intermediate stops when they occurred, control was even cruder. Some formations stopped at minor stations due to track congestion or military priority. At those points, opening a car was not an act of assistance but of counting and surveillance. Guards checked for escape attempts, removed corpses when the number became obvious, and closed the doors again. Prisoners' reaction was silence, because any sound could be interpreted as disorder. The immediate consequence was that many died without anyone knowing the exact moment. There was no clear before and after. There was a body that stopped responding and remained wedged among other bodies until the car opened and it was pulled out. While this was happening on routes westward, the SS administration in Auschwitz completed the abandonment. On January 18 and 19, the last groups capable of marching left the complex. Several thousand prisoners, mostly sick, remained in the barracks with minimal resources. The decision not to evacuate them did not imply a will to let them live. It implied that the SS could not or would not drag bodies that would collapse in the first meters. In that context, guards began to abandon posts, remove equipment, burn documents, destroy parts of the facilities, and withdraw. The prisoners who remained reacted with a mix of waiting and searching for food in abandoned stores, searching for clothing in piles, searching for a place where the cold was less aggressive. The immediate consequence was that when Soviet units approached, they found a camp partially dismantled but still functional in its essence. Barracks, fences, towers, and bodies that had not been moved. On the marches, decisions made at command level translated into simple instructions for escorts. One of those instructions repeated in survivor testimony and later reconstructions was that they were not to leave prisoners alive behind. The operational purpose was to prevent partial liberations during the retreat and to keep prisoners from blending into the population or being picked up by enemy forces. The concrete application of that instruction produced recognizable patterns. In wooded stretches or roads with ditches, stragglers were pulled out of the column and shot. In urban stretches, the method could vary. Beatings, dragging into a side entrance, a quick shot to avoid slowing the pace. The reaction of those nearby was not to turn their heads. The consequence was that the road was marked by a trail of bodies that in some places local residents and escaped prisoners saw in the following hours. The evacuation from Auschwitz also included marches that did not end at Loslau or Glewitz, but continued on foot for more days, depending on assigned destination and transport conditions. In some cases, columns went to intermediate camps, or to points where trains were supposed to be available and were not. The SS reaction in those situations was to keep marching, because holding thousands of prisoners stopped in one place without infrastructure risked mutiny, disease, and loss of control. The consequence was that some marches extended without a clear plan visible to those walking, and exhaustion became cumulative. A body might endure 1 day of marching, perhaps 2, but by the third day below zero without sufficient food, collapse was inevitable. Along the route, relations with civilians varied by area and moment. In Silesia, many localities were accustomed to seeing prisoners, forced laborers, or columns controlled by Germans. But the scale of January 1945 was different. It was not a small work detachment escorted to a factory. It was a massive flow of people in striped uniforms, physically extreme in appearance. In some places, there were attempts to throw bread or potatoes. In others, people shut doors and windows. When guards noticed movement from houses, they reacted by tightening control and accelerating. The consequence was that even when help was possible, it lasted seconds and could cost a life. Internally, the march imposed a silent accounting. At departure, Some groups had an approximate number of prisoners under guard. Each fall, each execution, each escape reduced that number. Guards counted when possible, especially at gathering points before loading onto trains. When the count did not match, the reaction was indiscriminate violence, punishing the entire line until someone appeared or until the group accepted that the number had changed. The immediate consequence was a discipline of terror that eliminated any visible cooperation to protect a straggler. Helping someone could mean falling with them and becoming the next case. On trains leaving Loslau and Gleiwitz, the most frequent destinations were the camp systems deeper in the Reich, including Buchenwald, Mauthausen, Gross-Rosen, and other complexes still operating as centers of forced labor and mass imprisonment. But travel was not direct. In January 1945, the German rail network was saturated and damaged. There were bombings, unusable tracks, locomotives diverted for military needs. The result was a fragmented route, with long stops, changes of train, and stretches where the convoy sat motionless in open countryside. Prisoners reacted by trying to conserve oxygen and energy, but that collided with the need to move to avoid freezing. The consequence was an impossible physical dilemma. Moving burned calories that did not exist. Staying still meant freezing. In those same days, the SS apparatus faced a command problem in retreat. Camp commandants received general orders, but execution depended on local resources, escort availability, and enemy proximity. At Auschwitz, Richard Baer left the area before the Soviets arrived. As many officers did, the structure did not collapse at once, it emptied out. Subordinate guards reacted by following the flow of retreat, obeying withdrawal orders, and in some cases discarding insignia or personal documents that could incriminate them. The consequence was that direct responsibility for many executions along the route was dispersed among multiple escort groups, later complicating individual attribution in many cases. For many survivors, the most brutal part of the march was not necessarily the first day. It was the moment when the body had consumed what little it had, and the mind began to function on blunt instinct. From the second or third day onward, hunger ceased to be a sharp pain and became a continuous condition. Cold ceased to feel like a stimulus and became a layer. At that point, some prisoners reacted by walking automatically, without thought, following the pressure of the group. The consequence was that the column could keep moving even when much of it was already in partial collapse. The march did not stop because it did not depend on will, but on inertia. In several documented episodes, the end of a day involved using improvised buildings as shelter, barns, empty factories, schools, sheds. This was not planned lodging. It was confinement to prevent dispersion at night. The method was simple. Push them in, close doors, post guards. Inside, prisoners reacted by trying to settle on the floor, piling bodies, finding a corner less exposed. The immediate consequence was suffocation in enclosed spaces, crushing when someone fell and could not rise, and deaths from hypothermia when dampness made it impossible to retain heat. The evacuation also had a gender dimension that the SS administration addressed without particular consideration. Women evacuated from Birkenau, or female subcamps, marched under conditions equal to or worse than men's, with insufficient clothing and surveillance that could include abuse in moments of isolation. Within the march, control over the body was total. No privacy, no medical care, no protection from escort violence. Women reacted by clustering when they could to reduce risk. The consequence was that the women's column, or women's segments within mixed columns, depended even more on internal cohesion to prevent a fall from becoming an immediate execution. As prisoners were redistributed to other camps, the evacuation from Auschwitz began producing a chain effect. Receiving camps, already overcrowded, took in new masses in extreme condition. That led to internal decisions: where to house them, how to register arrivals without clear documentation, what to do with the sick who could not work. Administrative reaction in many camps was to assign improvised barracks, cut rations, and demand labor from those who could still move. The consequence was that the death march did not end when they stepped off the train. It continued as a state, because the transfer was not a pause. It was a phase of the same system. Militarily, the Soviet advance did not stop for the evacuation. On the 27th of January 1945, Red Army units entered Auschwitz and liberated the prisoners who had been left behind. That marked a date, but it did not resolve the situation of those already in the columns or trains. For those prisoners, liberation of the camp of origin was a fact they could not hear. In their timeline, the next step was to reach a receiving camp or die in transit. The consequence was that Auschwitz's end as an operational center did not mean the end of its violence at that moment. The violence had shifted to roads and rail lines. On western routes, convoys began arriving at destinations where the SS administration tried to absorb them. At Buchenwald, for example, the camp was already full, and the arrival of evacuees produced immediate overcrowding. New prisoners were registered quickly, assigned numbers, blocked from moving, and separated into those still able to work and those already unable. Many newly arrived prisoners reacted by becoming motionless because the body had exhausted its capacity to respond. The consequence was that the system classified them as unfit and left them in barracks where death was inevitable. Applied again and again, that mechanism turned the march into a filter that ended inside another filter. At Mauthausen and its subcamps, reception was equally ruthless. The complex had a particularly brutal regime and, in 1945, absorbed evacuees from multiple camps. Arrival logistics included climbing down from wagons, forming ranks, passing gates, enduring endless roll calls in the open. The physical reaction was collapse. Someone who had survived days without water could fall during the first roll call. The consequence was immediate: beatings, dragging, and in many cases death at the very entrance. The transfer was not a path towards safety. It was a transfer within a geography of camps still operating. Meanwhile, in Silesia, the road continued to show visible signs of what had happened. In villages and at forest edges, some civilians saw abandoned bodies. At times, local authorities attempted hurried burials for sanitary reasons or out of fear of the Soviet arrival. At others, the bodies remained exposed until the front passed. Observers reacted ambivalently: fear, shock, silence. The consequence was that even before major trials and formal investigations, the landscape preserved physical evidence of the marches: ditches, improvised graves, abandoned striped clothing, footprints in snow that later melted. Within the SS apparatus, evacuation also meant personnel movement. Guards and officers who had served at Auschwitz were reassigned or blended into the general retreat. Some tried to disappear into moving units, others stayed in post to the end. Many reacted by erasing traces, burning documents, getting rid of photographs, changing uniforms. The consequence, for the post-war world, was that identifying specific perpetrators on specific stretches became difficult and often depended on testimony, partial reports, and isolated captures. Even so, the evacuation's logic left recognizable administrative patterns. Movements were tied to loading stations, main roads, and concentration points. Those localities' names appear again and again in reconstructions. Auschwitz Pshina Wodzisław Śląski, Auschwitz Tiki Mikołów Gliwice. That repetition does not imply narrative repetition. It implies the evacuation was a system with nodes. At each node, the same process repeated with new victims: a column's arrival, concentration, waiting, loading into cars, departure westward. The consequence was a continuity of violence in which the geographic point changed but the mechanism remained the same. In late January and in February 1945, some evacuees from Auschwitz were already integrated into new routines of forced labor. Others were still in transit because trains were diverted, halted, or abandoned. In some cases, when a convoy remained immobile too long, the SS chose to unload prisoners and force them to walk to the next rail point. Prisoners' reaction, hearing they would have to march again, was a mix of despair and automatism. The body already knew the logic. The consequence was a cycle, road, wagon, road, with no possible recovery. As the war neared its end, the death marches from Auschwitz blended with other mass evacuations from camps farther east. The entire system was retreating into the Reich, pushing prisoners as a human burden that could not be dropped without the risk of witnesses. That impulse persisted even when defeat was obvious. The SS reacted by sustaining control with increasingly brutal means, because there was no longer a horizon of long-term administration. The consequence was that in the final months, mortality during transfer spiked, and Auschwitz was one of the main points of origin for that flow. In the specific case of Auschwitz, the complex's operational end on January 27 did not close the story of its evacuated prisoners. That story continued on routes to Buchenwald, Mauthausen, Bergen-Belsen, and other destinations where, in the spring of 1945, new liberations would occur by Western Allied forces. For those who survived, memory of the march remained tied to concrete stimuli: snow underfoot, the sound of shots behind them, the metallic taste of hunger, the steam of breath in line. But on the factual level, the march was the direct result of administrative decisions in January 1945, executed through defined routes and logistical nodes, and sustained by a control criterion that accepted death as part of the procedure. The next step in that progression was the collision between evacuation and the total collapse of the system in April and May 1945, when receiving camps filled to the limit, and the SS tried to move prisoners again under Allied advance. At that point, some evacuees from Auschwitz were forced to march again, no longer from Silesia, but from inside Germany, driven by the same logic: move witnesses away from the approaching front. In February 1945, most Auschwitz evacuees still alive were already spread across an arc of camps and subcamps running from Lower Silesia to central and southern Germany and Austria. The SS administration attempted to absorb them using the same instrument it had always used: registration, assignment, roll call, and labor. In practice, that instrument functioned worse and worse. Transports arrived irregularly, lists were lost or arrived incomplete, and prisoners' physical state made it impossible to sustain the fiction of mass, usable labor. The bureaucratic reaction was not humanitarian but classificatory: separate those who could still walk and handle a tool from those who could not. The immediate consequence was that thousands were concentrated in reception barracks without a work assignment, with cut rations and accelerated mortality. At Gross-Rosen, for example, the subcamp system became a receiver for evacuees from the east for weeks. Infrastructure was already stretched to the limit by its own population, and the arrival of columns and trains added a volume the administration could not absorb stably. New arrivals were pushed through prolonged roll calls, then into overcrowded barracks, and from there into work detachments when possible. Prisoners reacted by reducing any unnecessary movement to conserve energy. The consequence, in an environment where survival depended on remaining visibly fit, was that many fell out of the labor circuit and sank into a gray zone. Neither sent onward again nor integrated into productive work, simply accumulated. At Buchenwald, the reception mechanism was executed with the formal precision of a camp that functioned as an administrative hub of a wide network. Numbers were assigned, blocks distributed, roll calls imposed, and men sent to industrial subcamps. But in 1945, that precision collided with material reality. The camp was overflowing. Each transport arriving from the east brought hundreds or thousands of men in extreme condition. The local SS administration reacted by intensifying disciplinary control to prevent internal collapse. The consequence was a rise in everyday violence at the moment of arrival. Beatings as they climbed down, forced runs into the interior, punishments for anyone who collapsed. The transfer from Auschwitz, which began as an evacuation, thus integrated into a reception system that already functioned as a deadly funnel. At Mauthausen and its constellation of subcamps, the situation was even more rigid because of the regime applied there. Evacuee transports intersected with endless roll calls, saturated barracks, and work orders that did not match actual physical condition. At this point, the administrative logic was direct: preserve exploitation capacity until the last day. Prisoners reacted by trying to stay upright, because falling meant being marked as useless. The consequence was that the camp accumulated a mass of men surviving by hours or days, with no recovery possible, while the system still demanded formal discipline. In that scenario, the decisive factor was the speed of the Allied advance on two fronts. In the east, the Red Army kept pushing toward the Oder and beyond. In the west, from late 1944 and especially in 1945, American, British, and Canadian forces advanced into Germany. For the SS, that double pressure reduced space and time. The next step, almost inevitable, was to order new evacuations from receiving camps, now not from Silesia but from inside the Reich, with the same obsession. Do not leave prisoners alive at the enemy's mercy. That shift became clear as March 1945 progressed. The SS administration, facing bombings, cut rail lines and retreating units, resorted again to the most basic method: moving columns on foot. Unlike January, these new marches were organized in more fragmented territory, with roads clogged by refugees, German units in retreat, and an increasingly chaotic logistical network. The immediate reaction was more frequent loss of control, columns dispersing, stretches where guards could not hold the perimeter, and answered with violence to restore it. The consequence was that deaths on the route rose again not only from cold, now less severe than in January, but from accumulated exhaustion and the breakdown of food supply. For prisoners originally evacuated from Auschwitz, the distinctive feature was that prior exhaustion. They did not start fresh for a new march. They started after weeks of overcrowding, chronic hunger, forced labor, or debilitating immobility in reception barracks. When the SS ordered them out, the body had no reserves. The reaction was to walk by inertia alone, because the alternative was immediate gunfire or collapse into a roadside margin without assistance. The consequence was that in many of these spring marches, the proportion of collapses in the first kilometers was higher than in January, even if temperatures were milder. The administrative dimension of these new evacuations was reflected in how orders were issued and carried out. Camp commandants received directives to clear facilities as the enemy neared, preserve SS personnel, and move prisoners toward zones still considered safe. Those zones changed week to week. A planned destination could become impossible in days due to Allied advance or the interruption of a rail line. Responsible officials reacted by improvising with what they had: marches to the next station, partial trains, diversions to alternate camps. The consequence was an erratic geography in which many prisoners never knew where they were being taken, because even the guards had no stable plan beyond the next stretch. In the case of Bergen-Belsen, for example, the camp received in 1945 a massive accumulation of evacuees from elsewhere. It was not designed to absorb that volume in collapse conditions. Local SS administration maintained formal control structures, but the medical and supply systems fell apart. For some Auschwitz evacuees, arriving there did not mean rest, but entry into an environment of extreme overcrowding where mortality surged through disease and starvation. Prisoners reacted by seeking the smallest possible space to lie down and conserve energy. The consequence was that bodies already weakened by the march and transport were exposed to an environment where survival depended on almost random factors. In camps like Dachau and its network of subcamps, the arrival of evacuees created immediate pressure as well. Dachau functioned as a labor distribution hub and a space of mass detention. In 1945, subcamps tied to factories and military construction received evacuees from the east to replace losses or sustain production. The administration tried to assign each group a productive destination, but the reality was that Germany's war economy could no longer sustain coherent planning. The reaction was to increase discipline and punishment to maintain output. The consequence was that many Auschwitz evacuees, already too weak to sustain heavy labor, ended up in punishment or abandonment zones within the network itself. At this point, the Death March ceases to be only the Auschwitz March and becomes part of a sequence of successive evacuations chained by military necessity and by the system's own structure. Yet the origin remains decisive. Auschwitz had been a central node of deportation and extermination, and its January 1945 evacuation dispersed tens of thousands into a network that, by March, began moving again. The consequence was that some survivors of the first transfer had to endure a second, sometimes a third, within a few weeks. In early April 1945, collapse accelerated. Front lines approached camps that had previously served as internal destinations. The SS began evacuating facilities to avoid direct liberations. In some places, evacuations mixed trains and foot columns. In others, only foot columns. The pattern repeated. Gather prisoners in the yard, form columns, depart without adequate rations, advance under armed escort. Prisoners reacted by trying to stay in the center of the column, because flanks and rear were where violence concentrated when someone fell behind. The consequence was a march with constant internal movement, shoves, attempts to hold up a companion, inevitable abandonments when bodies no longer responded. At Buchenwald, pressure from the American advance into Thuringia led to partial evacuation decisions. Columns were organized toward the south, with the intent of transferring prisoners to other camps or areas still under control. For some men coming from Auschwitz, that new movement was a final blow. After January, after transport, after weeks in a saturated camp, they were required to walk again. The reaction was a rising death toll along the route with each stretch. The consequence was that the German landscape in April 1945, not only Silesia in January, was strewn with prisoners' bodies from various origins, including many evacuated from Auschwitz. In that final phase, breaks in guard control became more frequent. Some guards followed orders to the last minute, shooting stragglers and firing at any escape attempt. Others began thinking about their own survival. In some cases, when a column drew near, Allied forces or nearby fighting could be heard. Some guards abandoned escort duty, tried to blend in with civilians, or discarded weapons. Prisoners' reaction, sensing that fracture, was to disperse or seek shelter. The consequence was partial liberation without ceremony, dangerous because the front was still active, but decisive because it interrupted the march cycle. Liberations in April and May, 1,945 closed, unevenly, the fate of those who had left Auschwitz in January. On the 11th of April 1945, American forces liberated Buchenwald. On April 15, British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen. On April 29, American forces liberated Dachau. On May 5, American forces liberated Mauthausen. These dates mark administrative endpoints for the camps, but for many Auschwitz evacuees, closure was more fragmented. Some were inside a camp on Liberation Day. Others were on the road, dispersed, hiding in forests or barns, or exhausted at a roadside when an advance unit found them. Immediate reaction to contact with Allied forces was not always celebration. Often, it was physical collapse, disorientation, inability to process. The consequence was that survival became an immediate medical and logistical problem: feeding, warming, treating infections, organizing shelter. In parallel, the documentary dimension began taking shape even before the formal end of the war. Liberating forces recorded what they found, collected testimonies, took custody of facilities and surviving documents. For the history of the marches from Auschwitz, this phase was crucial because the march had dispersed evidence. There was no single place to find the march as an event. There were routes, stations, mass graves, receiving camps, stopped trains. Investigators and medical teams reacted by building a picture from fragments. The consequence was that although the Auschwitz evacuation was designed in part to erase and disperse, it left a trail too broad to disappear. In the days after Auschwitz's liberation, in late January and February, the camp became a material reference point for what the system had been. But the march turned Silesia and much of the westward corridor into another kind of evidence: dispersed evidence. On roads to Loslau and Gleiwitz, and along the rail corridors that followed, bodies and survivors confirmed that the evacuation was not a regular transfer but an operation accepted as deadly in its design. Those who traversed those routes later reacted by finding remains, improvised graves, clothing, and sometimes groups of survivors who had not reached any camp because the column had broken. The consequence was that the end of the march was defined not only by the gate of a liberated camp, but by the point at which SS control disintegrated and the prisoners ceased to be moved by orders. In May 1945, with Germany's capitulation, the camp system ceased to exist as an operational structure. But immediate consequences persisted. In improvised hospitals, displaced persons camps, and reception centers, thousands of Auschwitz evacuees confronted the same problem they had faced on the march, now inverted. The body was alive, but could not sustain life without assistance. Allied administration had to establish records, classify, repatriate or resettle, and treat disease and malnutrition. For those reconstructing the sequence later, those post-war records made it possible to link names, routes, and dates. The march, which began as an evacuation order under Soviet advance, thus ended in a network of camps and hospitals under Allied control, where the goal was no longer transfer by coercion, but stabilization for survival. The chronological axis from January to May shows a continuous progression. The administrative decision to evacuate Auschwitz, execution through foot columns to rail nodes, transport in freight cars toward interior camps, failed absorption into overcrowded systems, new evacuations under Allied advance, the disintegration of SS control, and staggered liberations. At the center of that progression stand the same elements repeated not as narrative device, but as real mechanism: roll call, escort, pressure, collapse, elimination of the straggler, resumption of the pace. The end arrives not through a discursive conclusion, but through the material interruption of the system when there were no executable orders, not enough guards, and no territory left to keep pushing columns anywhere. In the months immediately afterward, reconstructing what happened in the Auschwitz evacuation became an administrative task in its own right. It was not about writing a history, but solving concrete problems, identifying the living, recording the dead, locating routes, finding graves, understanding which columns passed through which towns and on what dates. In Silesia and the corridors toward Loslau and Gleiwitz, local authorities and military units began receiving fragmentary reports. Corpses in ditches, groups of prisoners found in barns, survivors unable to walk who had been left out of any transport. Medical teams reacted by prioritizing the immediate, removing bodies to prevent epidemics, improvising burials, and moving the living to aid points. The consequence was that the march ceased to be movement and became a map of critical points, each with its own accounting. That accounting collided with a basic problem. The evacuation had scrambled records. At Auschwitz, before complete withdrawal, part of the documentation was destroyed or abandoned. On the routes, many prisoners were moved without their information traveling with them. In receiving camps, registration was often done under urgency, with names misspelled, numbers duplicated, or lists incomplete. New authorities, Soviet and Western, reacted by creating parallel systems. Survivor lists by camp, medical files, displaced person registers, and information requests from governments and aid organizations. The consequence was that the individual histories of thousands hung in dossiers that took months or years to set in order. For Auschwitz evacuees, first contact with aid structures did not mean immediate recovery. Severe malnutrition required clinical handling that did not always exist in the field. Rehydration and feeding had to be controlled. Accumulated cold and respiratory infections combined with typhus, dysentery, and other diseases associated with overcrowding and lack of hygiene. Many survivors reacted with total exhaustion. Sleeping without interruption, inability to eat without pain, disorientation. The consequence was that even after liberation, some evacuees died in improvised hospitals or reception centers, not due to direct violence, but due to the accumulated damage of the march, transport, and the following weeks. As survivors were stabilized, another chronological sequence began, also strict and administrative: locating those responsible. The Auschwitz evacuation had dispersed not only prisoners, but SS personnel. Some were captured during the retreat or in the Reich's final days. Others blended into units or tried to disappear in post-war chaos. Allied bodies reacted by launching interrogations, gathering testimony, and cross-checking data. The consequence was that the death marches, having occurred on roads and through towns, generated a particular kind of evidence. Not only prisoners' memory, but civilian observations, military reports, bodies found at precise locations, and traces at railway stations. In Auschwitz's case, names tied to the complex became linked to uneven timelines of capture and trial. Rudolf Höss, who had commanded Auschwitz during its central operating phase, was located and captured by British forces in 1946. He was interrogated as part of broader investigations and later transferred to Poland, where he was tried and executed in 1947. The January 1945 evacuation did not depend on him directly because he was no longer in command then, but the structure that made the clearing of the camp possible had been built during his administration. investigators reacted by using his knowledge as one piece of a larger puzzle. The consequence was that reconstructing the evacuation could connect the camp's internal functioning to the way the final transfer was executed. For those who commanded Auschwitz in the last phase, traceability was more complex. Richard Baer, commandant in the final period, left the area before Soviet arrival. His later fate became part of the late Postwar. He was found years later, arrested, and died in custody before a trial was completed. Administratively, the response was to insist on chain of command because the evacuation was not an isolated excess by an individual guard, but the application of an operational criterion. Evacuate prisoners westward, prevent partial liberation en route, and maintain control to the end. The consequence was that later proceedings relied both on individual responsibility and on describing a mechanism of orders. Meanwhile, the ground continued to produce evidence. In Silesian localities, with the late winter thaw, remains that had been hidden under snow appeared. Some improvised burial sites were identified by residents who had seen columns pass or had been forced to dig. Authorities and investigators reacted by documenting locations, exhuming when possible, and recording indications. The consequence was that the march acquired verifiable materiality. It was not only a story but a chain of concrete places where one could point to an intersection, a bridge, a ditch, a station. Route reconstruction also made it possible to separate phases within a single progression without breaking linearity. From the origin at Auschwitz and Birkenau, columns went to specific rail nodes. From those nodes, convoys went to interior camps. From those camps, in March and April, some prisoners were evacuated again. And finally, the disintegration of SS control and Allied liberation interrupted the process. Those organizing reports reacted by presenting that sequence as a continuous flow, not isolated episodes. The consequence was that analysis of the march shifted. The main event stopped being a single march and became an evacuation procedure lasting months across multiple geographies. For survivors, the post-war stage was also a chain of administrative steps. Many could not return immediately to their places of origin. Borders had shifted, cities were destroyed, and civil records were incomplete. Displaced person camps were created in Allied zones, with systems of identification, interviews, and lodging assignment. Auschwitz evacuees reacted by searching for family, confirming names, reconstructing trajectories. The consequence was that the last stretch of the march extended in another sense, no longer under armed escort, but still shaped by lists, permits, and transfers now under new authorities for different ends. In Central and Eastern Europe, Soviet liberation produced another circuit. In Poland, Auschwitz quickly became a site of investigation and institutional memory, but also a space where objects were stored, documents recovered, and survivors interviewed. Local teams reacted by ordering what could be saved, because the camp, though partly abandoned, still held traces. Barracks, barbed wire, depots, and infrastructure remains. The consequence was that the evacuation could be studied from the void it created. Comparing what remained in the camp with what had existed weeks earlier made visible the scale of the January disappearance. In the West, Allied armies liberating camps also found columns in motion or traces of recent columns. In some cases, advance units found groups of prisoners abandoned by escorts who had fled. In others, they found stopped trains with people locked inside. The reaction was to open, feed, transport, and register. The consequence was that evidence of evacuation was not confined to one theater. Auschwitz was an origin, but the phenomenon manifested across regions, expanding documentation of the transfer method itself. Sealed freight cars, station roll calls, elimination of stragglers, improvised nightly confinement. As 1945 progressed, investigative commissions and military teams gathered testimonies in a repeated structure: departure date, route, loading station, transport duration, destination, and episodes of death along the way. Survivors' reaction in giving testimony was often to return to the same starting point, the moment the order came to form up and leave. The consequence was that, layered together, testimonies revealed consistent patterns without relying on a single voice. Columns passing through the same towns, stations receiving waves on specific days, and destinations recurring according to rail availability. That layering also allowed, cautiously, the human impact to be measured without inflated figures. The Auschwitz evacuation moved tens of thousands. Along the way, thousands died from shootings, hypothermia, hunger, suffocation in cars, disease accelerated in receiving camps, and physical collapse after liberation. Investigators reacted by avoiding a single easy number because deaths occurred in different phases and places. The consequence was a more precise picture. Not one sudden catastrophe, but a sequence of cumulative mortality linked to repeated transfer decisions. In that sequence, the starting point, January 1945, retains its operational meaning. The Soviet offensive forced the SS to choose between abandoning prisoners in the camp or moving them. It chose to move those who could walk and abandon those who could not. Then, on the road, it applied a speed rule. Whoever fell was removed. At the station, it applied a filling rule. Pack cars to the limit. At the receiving camp, it applied an absorption rule. Classify as fit or useless. And when the front approached again, it repeated the movement. The system's reaction at each phase was the same. Maintain control and remove the obstacle to control. The consequence was that the death march from Auschwitz was not an accident of war's end, but the last expression of an existing method, executed under urgency and collapsing resources. By the end of 1945, that method was fixed in reports, routes marked on maps, and investigative files. But for evacuees, the timeline still did not end. Many remained in displaced person camps, waiting for documentation, transport, or news of relatives. Others were repatriated to countries where return meant new interrogations, new lists, new borders. The march, strictly speaking, had ended when SS escorts stopped pushing columns westward, but its administrative consequences continued. Missing death certificates, incomplete identities, trajectories cut off at stations, and roadside ditches without formal record. New authorities reacted by trying to close those gaps with forms and testimony. The consequence was that the march's end, whether in January, February, or April, depending on the individual, continued projecting into the post-war as a problem of reconstructing lives dispersed by an evacuation designed to disperse them. From the strictly operational viewpoint, the final phase closed when there was no longer a structure capable of sustaining further evacuations. In April and May 1945, many columns that included evacuees from Auschwitz ceased to exist as units because escorts dissolved, roads were cut by fighting, or Allied forces reached the area before the next transfer could be completed. That ending was not uniform. Sometimes liberation came directly in a camp. Sometimes it came at a station where a train never departed. Sometimes in a forest or on a side road where guards abandoned the column. Prisoners' immediate reaction, in any of these scenarios, was to find a minimal form of stabilization: food, water, warmth, a place to lie down without the movement continuing. The consequence was that the march's last stretch became a dispersion of survivors in critical medical condition, forcing the forces that found them to turn liberation into a sanitary and registration operation. For those found on the road, Allied procedure tended to follow a sequence: quick identification, transport to a medical point, triage by severity, and when possible, incorporation into a displaced persons center. On mobile fronts, that sequence was carried out with limited means. Medical teams prioritized hypothermia, dehydration, and obvious infections, but confronted a central problem. Prolonged starvation required careful, sustained management, and forward units did not always have stable facilities. Organizational reaction was to evacuate to the rear as soon as possible. The consequence was a reverse chain of transfers, no longer driven by SS coercion, but moved by ambulances, trucks, and medical evacuation trains, with the same physical fragility that had made the earlier transfer deadly. For those liberated inside receiving camps, closure chronology was clearer. Buchenwald, liberated on the 11th of April 1945 by American forces, held evacuees from the east who had arrived in previous months. Bergen-Belsen, liberated on April 15 by British forces, contained a population in critical state due to overcrowding and supply collapse. Dachau, liberated on April 29 by American forces, and Mauthausen, liberated on May 5, closed other branches of the circuit to which Auschwitz evacuees had been sent. Allied commanders' reaction upon entering those camps was to secure the perimeter, seize facilities, separate captured SS personnel, and organize aid with available resources. The immediate consequence was that while liberation ended SS control, it did not automatically halt mortality. Many prisoners died in the following days from accumulated damage before adequate care existed. In parallel, documentary reconstruction advanced with a practical goal: turn dispersed experiences into a verifiable record. Allied teams and local authorities compiled reports of findings along routes, survivor lists in hospitals, and prisoner counts in displaced persons camps. They recorded names, prisoner numbers when available, places of origin, language, and approximate route. Organizers reacted by using fixed points to reconstruct movement, stations like Loslau and Glavitz, identifiable receiving camps, and liberation dates. The consequence was that the Auschwitz evacuation could be described as a chronological progression of decisions and routes, even when fine detail differed from column to column. That reconstruction also served to delimit responsibility across different phases. The order to evacuate Auschwitz under Soviet pressure became an administrative fact: a decision to remove prisoners, a departure schedule, routes to rail nodes, and execution by SS escorts. Violence on the road, though often carried out in individual acts, fit a procedural frame. Keep pace, prevent dispersion, eliminate stragglers. Investigators reacted by identifying that frame as practice, not a sum of incidents. The consequence was that later analysis did not depend on a single mass killing, but on describing a method repeated over kilometers and days. Over 1,945 and the years that followed, collected information fed trials and commissions. In Poland, Auschwitz-related trials sought to establish how the complex operated and what responsibility lay with those who ran it. The evacuation, as the final act, became part of the whole, not an isolated episode, but the camp's operational closure under enemy proximity. In Germany and other jurisdictions, later investigations tried to trace SS members and auxiliaries involved in escorts or transport administration. Institutional reaction was often slow, dependent on captures, testimony, and surviving documentation. The consequence was uneven individual attribution. Patterns and command responsibility could be established, but not every roadside execution could be tied to a specific name. On the ground, memory of the marches remained anchored to precise places: villages crossed by columns, road bends where bodies were found, stations where wagons were loaded, yards where prisoners were held for hours. In some cases, local authorities documented improvised burials. In others, locations were known through testimony and confirmed by later findings. Those attempting to organize this information reacted geographically. Trace routes, mark points, correlate dates. The consequence was that the Auschwitz march, by definition mobile, became fixed along a recognizable corridor with repeated nodes that allowed reconstruction of the flow. That geographic fixing helped separate layers of the process without breaking continuity. First, the start in Auschwitz, the evacuation decision, the formation of columns, departure westward. Second, the road phase, enforced pace, elimination of stragglers, improvised nightly confinement. Third, the rail phase. Loading into cars, stops, suffocation. Removal of corpses at halts. Fourth, reception in interior camps. Registration, classification, overcrowding, new labor demands or immobilization until collapse. Fifth, spring evacuations, new movements, breakdown of control, partial and final liberations. Survivors' reaction in narrating the sequence tended to follow the same order because it was the order their bodies endured. The consequence was a set of accounts that, layered together, reinforced the process's linearity without needing to backtrack or re-explain mechanisms already described. For those who survived multiple transfers, the real administrative end was not liberation, but later stabilization. That stabilization was managed in displaced persons camps, military hospitals, and reception centers. Files were opened, identities recorded, and minimal civil continuity attempted. Aid organizations reacted by prioritizing controlled feeding, sanitation, clothing, and basic shelter, then beginning repatriation or resettlement processes. The consequence was that many Auschwitz evacuees spent months in an intermediate condition, free from SS escort, but still shaped by lists, permits, and transfers now under other authorities and for other purposes. In that stage, the Auschwitz evacuation still had a concrete effect. Dispersion had broken family links and fragmented national or communal groups that had survived together in the camp. After liberation, part of the effort focused on rebuilding those links through name registers, notices, camp searches, and cross-zone information exchange. Survivors reacted by identifying acquaintances through any available detail: number, language, place of origin, a subcamp name, a departure date from Auschwitz. The consequence was that evacuation, which had functioned as dispersion under SS control, produced a post-war task in reverse: reconstruct trajectories from fragments. In terms of closing the main chronological axis, the endpoint of the Auschwitz march is defined by the last phase in which the system could still keep those prisoners moving under coercion. That point varies by individual, but the general framework expires when the German retreat can no longer sustain armed columns or evacuation trains with any usable destination. From April and May 1945 onward, what continued was not a march organized as a procedure, but the movement of survivors for medical and administrative reasons, and the processing of evidence by new authorities. Institutional reaction focused on two practical goals: immediate aid and building records. The consequence was that the death marches from Auschwitz ended as an operation of the concentration camp system, while their effects, cumulative mortality, dispersion, record loss, and identity reconstruction continued in files and routes throughout the post-war period. When the sequence is observed without repetition and without turning back, the flow is defined by a rigid chain of steps. Soviet advance makes evacuation a priority. SS administration selects those who can walk. Columns leave toward Loslau and Glewitz. The road becomes a lethal filter of cold, hunger, and execution of stragglers. Stations operate as funnels to load freight cars. Trains transport under suffocation and exposure. Receiving camps absorb evacuees into already saturated systems. Allied pressure forces new evacuations, and the Reich's final collapse interrupts control, producing staggered liberations and roadside discoveries. That axis is exhausted when the next transfer within the system is no longer possible. After that, what remains is a verifiable trail across routes, stations, lists, and files originating in a January 1945 decision and carried out through methods that accepted death as the immediate consequence of keeping the march in motion.